This week we continue our lessons on growing older and wiser. And of course each week I do a little short recap of the lesson the week prior. I did want to bring up one thing from a couple of weeks ago, and this is the thing that drives me crazy about teaching a class is all of the things that you think of after you've taught the lesson. You think of something that really should have been obvious, that should have been highlighted, and you just don't think about it at the time. But I was talking to Nancy after church last week, and she brought up the lesson about Job and Elihu, and she mentioned something that I really didn't think about, but it was really a great point. And she said, you'll recall that 2 weeks ago we were talking about being able to learn something and to gain some wisdom from somebody younger than we are, which as older folks, sometimes we think we can't learn anything from a younger person, somebody that doesn't have as much experience as we do. But Elihu showed us that that's not always the case. The point that Nancy brought up that I thought was so good was she said, Elihu, when he went to give Job counsel, he sat and he listened to Job's 3 friends, and he didn't speak up. He was angry. He was angry with the 3 friends for the things that they were saying to Job. He was angry at Job for the things that he was saying, but the one thing that he didn't do was speak immediately. And it highlighted the idea that, how many times do we forfeit a great opportunity to teach somebody something about being a Christian, or to point out the truth to someone, because what we have to say to them, although it may be something really brilliant and valid, but we say it in anger. Hold on just a second. Can y'all hear me?
Just a little bit.
Okay. I wasn't sure I remembered to turn it on. Is that better, Dr. May?
All right. It's not you, it's me.
Okay. I saw you doing that. I wanted to make sure you could hear. Sorry. But anyway, sometimes we have the opportunity to share our wisdom with someone, but we or give them some unsolicited advice, but there are times when we're angry with those people and we speak before we should speak. And that's the one thing that I think Elihu did. His wisdom manifested itself maybe not so much in what he said, but when he chose to say it. And I hope that that's something that we're learning as we get older, is that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is not to speak out immediately, but to wait for the right opportunity to share our thoughts and our advice with somebody else. Okay, so last week, to do a quick recap of what we talked about last week, we started a new lesson that focused on this idea that sometimes we're going to be in a position where it's necessary for us to share the truth with someone, to give somebody some advice when there's the potential for that to cause conflict between us and that person. We know that sometimes, hopefully not very often, but sometimes that situation arises in the church, and that's why we have Matthew chapter 18 verses 15 through 17. If you go there, the writer lays out a process by which we are supposed to go to a brother or sister who needs correction, and it specifically tells us how you handle that situation. You go to them first in private, so as not to embarrass them or create a big scene. And if they won't listen to you, then you bring somebody else with you to talk to them. And if that doesn't work, then you bring it before the church. Y'all are familiar with that. So there's a process by which you go to someone in the church, and if you have to share the truth with them about something. Sometimes, though, as we get older, we find ourselves in the position of having to have as we like to call it in today's vernacular, a come to Jesus with somebody who is a family member. Sometimes it's an adult child. And at best, those situations can be uncomfortable, depending on how you handle the situation with that person. At worst, it can cause a rift in a family. And we've seen that before, where somebody goes to their adult child, or maybe a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law, and has to say, you know, you're going down the wrong path. I see you about to make a mistake, and they try to correct that person, and it causes a divide in the family that doesn't heal up. So those situations can be very delicate. So last week we used Exodus 18 as our text, and if you want to go ahead and be turning there, we read half of it last week. We're going to read the second half this week. In Exodus 18, we have this situation where there's an encounter between Jethro and Moses, and Moses is Jethro's son-in-law. So by the time we get to chapter 18 of Exodus, Moses has already led the Israelites out of Egypt. And Jethro is coming out to meet Moses, and he's got, Jethro has his daughter, Moses' wife, and his two grandsons, Jethro's two grandsons. He has them with him, and he's coming out to meet his son-in-law, Moses. Now, you'll recall from last week, there are some things that are very different about Moses and Jethro. They come from different cultural backgrounds. They come evidently from different religious backgrounds. So those can be points of contention. They also are very similar in some ways. Both of them are leaders of people. So you'll recall Jethro is a priest. He's well respected among his people. And Moses, of course, is the handpicked by God, handpicked leader of an entire nation of Israel, who he has just led out of Israel and led out of hundreds of years of bondage. So both of these men they're used to being the heads of their families. They're used to being the ones who are in charge. Okay, so people come to them for advice. They're probably not used to taking a whole lot of advice from other people. So last week we read verses 1 through 12. And so we only got half of the story. Now, so far at this point, what has happened is, of course, Jethro has come out to meet Moses, and Moses shows in these first 12 verses really how much he loves and respects his father-in-law. Because if you look back, you'll see that as Moses sees Jethro approaching, you remember what he did? Bows down before him, okay? And that was a show of respect. That was basically Moses. And I'm imagining this isn't done in private. I'm guessing that there are probably a lot of people around that are seeing this. And so Moses is publicly showing that he is deferring to his father-in-law. To bow before someone in those days was to say, this person is in a higher social status or strata than I am. So not only does Moses show respect for Jethro, he also shows how much he loves him because he kisses him. And that's a show of friendship. The flip side of that is Jethro does some things to show how much he loves Moses and respects him. So you'll recall that Jethro makes an animal available for sacrifice. He doesn't necessarily do the sacrificing himself, as far as I'm aware, but he makes this animal available for the Israelites to sacrifice, to give thanks to their God for getting them out of Egypt. Then the other thing that he does that's important is he sits down, Jethro does, sits down with Moses' people, his family, and shares a meal with them. And that's obviously that's a sign of friendship and showing kinship with someone else. So we're going to pick up the story there. That's where we got to last week. We're going to pick it up in verse 13. So we will read now verses 13 through 27 and see what happens from that point forward. Okay, so the next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to Him. Teach them the decrees and laws, and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. Okay, so here we see that Moses has shouldered the entire responsibility for settling disputes between the Israelites. They have the law, but they don't have anyone else to interpret it for them except for Moses. They don't have a judicial system. Moses is it. So I think a lot of us can sympathize with Moses and understand just how exhausting this must be to deal with all of these people and all of their problems. Because as I look out here, I see some of you who have owned your own business and you've had employees, and some of you have, in your careers, you have been in positions of authority and where you've been over a lot of people. And I was thinking about you. If I remember right, you rose to the rank of a major, is that right?
A major in security, and then I went to a different program or something.
Right. But I'm guessing you had people under you that came to you. So what happens when you're in a position of authority, especially something like that? I'm guessing you dealt with problems all day long, every day. So when you're in that kind of position, you're the go-to person. And so if anything goes wrong, it's you they come to. If somebody has a problem or a dispute, it's you they come to. And I did that for a little while. I was a manager at my previous job, and I didn't care for it because I had enough, I didn't have enough time to deal with my own issues, and then I had other people come in and, we need this, and this isn't right, and this product is broken. And it was very, very stressful. I can't imagine what Moses must have been going through, dealing with all of these people. And we know from what we read that the Israelites can be a very petty and petulant group of people. Sometimes they behave like little children. So Jethro he's kind of a detached observer of all of this. He sits and he watches the people come to Moses with their problems. And they're standing around waiting, probably not very patiently. They're waiting their turn to bring their case to Moses and let him interpret, settle the dispute through his interpretation of the law. So, Jethro sees what Moses can't see because he's too close to the fire. He's too close to the problem. And Jethro he's kind of sitting on the sidelines as a neutral observer watching all of this. He sees that this arrangement just can't go on successfully for very long. And he says that. Moses obviously is going to wear himself out, not just physically, but mentally. And the people, they're not going to be happy either because they're all standing around waiting, and you can imagine how long this line is, and they get turned away and come back tomorrow. We can't get to you today. So they're going to be frustrated by this setup as well. Just to give us kind of an idea of how many people Moses must have been dealing with, Exodus 12 verse 37 tells us that there were about 600,000 men that came out of Egypt. That's not including the women and children. So if that gives you an idea of how many people there were, that doesn't mean that all of them were waiting to talk to Moses, but you can imagine out of that number of more than 500,000 people, that the line was probably pretty long. It's just not reasonable to think that one man could take care of settling the disputes for that number of people. So here's a question. If you're a reasonably intelligent, common sense type person and you're sitting there watching Moses deal with this situation, dealing with the people's problems, how long is it going to take you to figure out this is not going to work out? Probably not very long, is it? I'm guessing that Jethro probably within maybe a few minutes, inside of an hour, I'm sure, of watching this unfold, he already has a pretty good idea that this isn't going to work. Moses is going to get himself in trouble. But here's another question. How long, according to what we read, how long does Jethro wait before he says something? Does he say something immediately? Moses, you got a problem? No, the way I read it is he sat there and watched from morning until evening. He sat there for hours without saying anything, just watching. He was a silent observer. Do you think he waited an appropriate length of time before he spoke up? Did he need to sit there and watch this go on for longer than a day? No, like I said, Jethro probably had it figured out within a few minutes, maybe an hour. But he sat there all day long watching this without offering his opinion. If you look back at verses 14 and 15, Jethro does something else that I think shows his wisdom. He asks Moses a question. He says, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" So Jethro gives Moses the opportunity to explain what he's doing, why he's doing these things. Before he tells Moses what he thinks he should do, Jethro asks him a question and gives Moses the opportunity to give his perspective. Now, as older people or more mature people, and I'm talking about us in this room here, being more mature people, we have the advantage of having a lot of life experiences that a younger person doesn't have. I'm sure, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I know that in my short, 50-something years on earth, I've made a lot of mistakes. Hopefully I've learned from those mistakes, and I feel like because of that, I'm able to share, my wisdom with a younger person. Particularly my son, because he hasn't had the benefit of that experience yet. The danger in that, when we have a family member, and like an adult child or a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law, the danger of us feeling like we have so much experience that we can step in. When we see them, when we observe them going down what we think is the wrong path, or we see them maybe either making a choice or a series of choices that we know are going to lead to something bad, to some bad consequences. What are we tempted to do? We want to intervene immediately. We want to get a hold of them and say, you don't need to do this. We don't give them a chance to explain themselves or to give their perspective. Sometimes we don't take time to try to understand the whole situation, because we think, because of our experience, that we already know all we need to know about it. And we're just going to step in and say, no. I don't want to hear your explanation. I don't want to hear your perspective. Here's what you need to do. Do we ever do that? Okay. Jethro doesn't make that mistake, even though he's pretty certain of what's going on here and how to fix it. He doesn't immediately jump in and give Moses his opinion. He takes the time to try to understand the problem, and he asks a question and gives Moses the opportunity to explain his side of it. But now, once Jethro has watched this situation unfold with the people, and he's taken the time to observe and to listen to Moses give his side of it, he's pretty blunt in his assessment of the situation. He doesn't hold back on the truth. He's very straightforward in telling Moses this situation is not going to go well for much longer. Do you think that, knowing Moses and his background and his personality, that Jethro might have had some hesitation in giving Moses this unsolicited advice? Would he have had a reason to think that Moses might not have responded very well to being told, hey, I think you're making a mistake here? What do we know about Moses' personality?
He killed somebody one time.
He did, yes. Yes. Moses, I've seen him described as being a little bit of a hothead. And yes, you're right. His anger, which I guess we could say was righteous anger. He had a very clear sense of right and wrong, but he saw this Hebrew slave being mistreated by a taskmaster. But he didn't handle the situation. He didn't resolve it the right way. He let his anger overcome him, and he killed this man. We saw a flash of Moses' anger when he came down off of Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, and I would have been mad too. Moses has just spent 40 days in the presence of the Lord, and nothing but just a pure and holy experience, and he comes down, and the Israelites have taken up idol worship. But he takes the tablets that God has inscribed with his own hand, and he breaks them in a fit of anger. So Moses, like I said, has a quick trigger. He's got a little bit of a quick temper. So we know that when we approach somebody who has that kind of personality, and we need to share the truth with them, or need to correct them, it can create it can cause us to hesitate, to pause a little bit, can't it? Okay, but look at verse 19, and let's see what kind of approach Jethro takes as he begins to explain to Moses that there is maybe a better way to judge the people than what he's doing. Jethro says, "Listen to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you." I read another translation that said, "Listen to me, and God will be with you." I think what Jethro is doing here is that he's alluding to the fact that the advice that he's about to give Moses is really coming from God, and that it's not necessarily his own opinion. He's saying this is something that your God is trying to communicate to you. You'll notice that when Jethro starts talking to Moses, that of course he doesn't attack Moses. He doesn't say anything to suggest that Moses is unfit, that he's not worthy of carrying out this task. He doesn't say anything about you're not wise enough to handle this task of judging the people. He doesn't suggest that the task is beneath him. In fact, Jethro reinforces the idea that Moses has a responsibility that only he can fulfill. Jethro says that Moses must be the people's representative before God, and that he must be the one who brings their disputes before God. Jethro points out that this job that Moses has of deliberating all these disputes is so big that God really needs to be the one who shoulders the responsibility, who bears the weight of it. And Moses should then move into the role of being an intermediary between the people and God, but not necessarily their only judge. So, after Jethro very tactfully explains to Moses that this situation, this arrangement that he has right now of being the only judge of the people is not going to work, he then offers a workable solution. And that's something else I think that shows his wisdom. I know there are a lot of times when we're talking, again, to use as an example, our children, whether they be young or older and mature, but when we have to point out something to them where they may be erring, a lot of times when we sit down and we talk to them, we point out everything they're doing wrong, but we don't do a good job of giving them a solution to the problem. Jethro doesn't make that mistake. So the first thing he does is he tells Moses that he needs to start at the top. He says the first thing you need to do is to teach the people, all of the people, the law. Explain the law to them, teach it to them, show them how to live. And as I was reading that, it made me think about the saying that we've all heard, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, how long do you feed him for? A whole lifetime. And that seems to me what Jethro is doing here is he's saying, if you teach the people the law, and you're not the sole owner of this knowledge, if they understand the law, then a lot of these disputes probably aren't going to arise in the first place. They're going to know how to handle themselves, and these things aren't even going to come into existence. But also, when they do happen, when disputes do break out between two parties, if the people know the law that Moses has taught to them, there's a good chance that a lot of them are going to be able to settle these disputes on their own, and they're not going to have to bring it to somebody like Moses or another intermediary. So he says, start at the top, teach everyone the law. Then Jethro gives Moses some more good advice by telling him he needs to handpick men just like himself, men who are God-fearing, men who are completely trustworthy, and not just honest men, but men who hate dishonesty. And he says, appoint them as judges over the people. And there's a hierarchy. And so the way I picture it is, there's almost like in the military where you have like a command structure with a general at the top, and at the very bottom you have sergeants and corporals and people like that. That's kind of what I am getting by the way they describe this judicial system, where Moses is at the top, and then you have all of these different judges that handle cases for smaller and smaller groups of people. So then Jethro tells Moses, of course, that he needs to be the one to continue to handle the most difficult cases. But the implementation of this system of deputy judges is really going to lighten his load. And it's going to allow Moses to be able to function as the leader of a nation the way he needs to, instead of somebody who's getting into the weeds and settling all of these, what I imagine are a lot of them are very petty disputes between people.
Well, one thing is
Yes.
these people had lived in slavery for 400 years. They didn't have any kind of structure to their lives other than to do what their taskmaster told them to do.
That's a good.
How did they had to be taught how to live?
That's a good point. It's almost kind of, to use an analogy, it's like people that lived in the Soviet Union for all of their lives, and now they have this newfound freedom. Well, how do we interact with each other? Yeah, that's a good point. They were used to just being told exactly what to do all the time, or else. But now they have their freedom, and yeah, they wouldn't have any way of knowing how to interact with each other. It's just about time to close out. I was going to make one last quick point here. We spent a lot of time focusing on Jethro and his wisdom, but if you look at the way Moses reacts to Jethro's suggestions and his advice, Moses shows just as much wisdom as Jethro, because it says, verse 24 says, Moses listened to his father-in-law and he did everything he said. And so Moses showed his wisdom by demonstrating that he was teachable and that he was willing to listen to the counsel of another person. And Moses, I guess you could say, was flexible. And that's something that I think a lot of times we lose in our old age, is our flexibility and being open to new ideas and doing something a different way to do it better. But Moses was open to listening to his father-in-law. He did everything he said, and things worked out. Proverbs 12:15. We'll end right there. Proverbs 12:15 kind of does a good job of summing up what Moses understood. And it says, "The way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice."